Growing up close to two major amusement parks, I've always been a huge fan of roller coasters. Naturally, this translated into many hours of my childhood playing the Rollercoaster Tycoon series. Some of my fondest memories in gaming come from playing these games, and in fact, I still play a ton of Rollercoaster Tycoon to this day. It's too easy for me to get immersed in the game for hours, trying to perfect my latest coaster creation. And yes, I did indulge in killing off peeps from time to time, but who hasn't? So imagine my excitement when it's announced that a new title in the series would be released in 2015. That title is Rollercoaster Tycoon World. Originally scheduled for release earlier this year, the game has since seen a few delays, with multiple developers coming and going. Couple these facts with the abysmal trailer released back in March, it was pretty easy to dismiss this as a failure from the get-go. However, Invisio, the game's latest developer, was able to inspire some hope in the community thanks to the reveal of the overhauled engine and the new coaster builder back in August. All of that newfound hope was put to the test over this past Halloween weekend for the game's first official beta. So how did it do? Well, the immediate reactions were bad. Like, really bad. And to be honest, mine was too, but that slowly changed over the course of the full weekend as I got more and more comfortable with the game. Quick disclaimer before my thoughts. While I've played a ton of Rollercoaster Tycoon 1 and 2, I have little experience in 3. My PC growing up just couldn't handle it, and I ended up missing the boat on that game. So if you think I need more context on how certain features worked in Rollercoaster Tycoon 3, let me know in the comments below. Now, the biggest feature of the beta was of course the coaster editor. In fact, Invisio made it a point to mention that testing the coaster editor was the primary goal of this first beta. To this point, we had only seen the coaster builder demoed by Invisio employees, and from what we saw, it looked really awesome and powerful. But upon loading up the beta for the first time and giving it a try, I quickly found myself confused and frustrated, and I wasn't alone. This is where most, if not all, of that initial wave of criticism spawned. The new spline system, while flexible, seemed overly finicky. The smallest of mouse movements would cause the track to twist and turn in ways that made even the most basic coaster elements a chore to make. The integrated grid system didn't seem to function properly, and building without it led to oddly curved sections of track that should otherwise be straight. Nothing seemed to work correctly with it. Coming from the simple builders of Tycoon 1 and 2, this new tool seemed broken and completely overwhelming to me. At first. Thankfully, I decided to stick it out, and after about an hour or so learning it, I was finally able to put together some really great looking coasters. I'm a fan of creating rides that look like they'd exist in real life parks, and the new coaster builder makes that pretty easy to do. That is, once you get the hang of it. Once I wrapped my head around the different ways you can manipulate the track, the new builder made me feel like anything was possible, like the only limit was my own imagination. This has made older iterations in the series feel properly ancient in comparison. Since the beta ended, I've had a lot of trouble returning to the limited builder of Rollercoaster Tycoon 2, as it's just not nearly as satisfying after experiencing the freedom of the new coaster builder. Now, with all that being said, it's still not perfect. In fact, it's far from it. As alluded to earlier, the learning curve is ridiculously high, and if this beta taught us anything, it's that many people did not have the patience to learn it. Even after learning the builder, it's still unnecessarily difficult to create certain elements, especially inversions. In fact, I've yet to make a standard vertical loop that doesn't look wonky. Including pre-built click and drop elements in the final version should fix this, but even the pre-built loop in the beta looks off still. Most of the coaster types included in the beta looked and performed similarly. Some of the train designs are questionable, such as older designs being used for the dive and stand-up coaster trains, but ultimately it doesn't negatively affect gameplay and might even be customizable later thanks to Steam Workshop support. The only coaster type that wasn't up to snuff was the wooden coaster, though Invisio was quick to announce that it was knowingly broken in this beta build, so I'll withhold judgment for now. The color guide used to signify stable and unstable sections of track didn't seem to be all that helpful either. Many times I would create sections that looked perfectly fine but would show up as red or unstable in the guide. Upon testing these sections, the coaster would usually pass through it successfully, so I learned to ignore the guide for the most part. I'm not exactly sure if this is how the guide is intended to work, but it feels like they should tweak it a little bit more to be more meaningful. Speaking of things I don't understand, I have no idea how coaster ratings work in this game. Despite my best efforts at creating realistic coasters that I would love to ride, I can't get an excitement rating over 4. I mean, my Fury 325 recreation gets a measly 3.75 excitement rating, so something is seriously screwed up there. Lastly, the on-demand grid tool was both good and bad. It certainly helps create smoother and straighter sections of track most of the time, however it was also very inconsistent. There were many times that I couldn't align the track with the grid properly, and it was frustrating watching the track swing back and forth on the grid at imperfect angles. This is something that will definitely need adjusting going forward, and in doing so I think it will help reduce a lot of people's frustrations with this new builder. Overall, I loved using it, but there's definitely room for improvement. If they improve a lot of the issues I mentioned, and maybe include a damn tutorial for the thing, Invisio could have a real winner on their hands with this. Outside of the coaster builder, the beta included some of the pathing, scenery, and terrain options that will be included in the final release. Much has been made about the path tool and its ability to create curved paths, a first in the series. The tool is pretty straightforward to use, and the curved paths do look nice, but it seems far too limited at this point. I often struggled with connecting curved paths together due to weird angles or some other odd reason, resulting in paths that jut around at nonsensical angles. The lack of stairs is a problem, as the only way to raise a path was along a slope, which needs very long stretches of path to work correctly, again looking unnatural. However, my biggest gripe so far is the path widths. You can only choose between small, medium, or large widths. In my opinion, this is far too limiting, especially since you can't currently link paths next to each other to create double wide sections. In previous games, I enjoyed linking many tiles of path together to create large, realistic plazas for certain areas, and with the new path tool, I'm afraid that might no longer be possible. I'm hoping they will make some serious tweaks to this either by launch or shortly after, but what they have now is decent enough. Scenery was another mixed bag. Most of the objects look great in game, and I was surprised by the variety of scenery they included in this first beta. If this ends up being all the scenery they include at launch, then it would surely be disappointing, but this is one aspect of the game where I think the developers can afford to disappoint, as the RCT community has proven that they can create some amazing custom scenery objects. But the biggest issue by far with scenery is the placement tool. Currently, every object needs to be placed individually, making something as simple as a fence line an absolute chore to create. While there is a method of snapping objects in place, it didn't seem to work consistently. Often the snapping function would just stop working in certain areas for some unknown reason, like with this fence line here. As you can see, I can still place fence objects next to each other, however they can't snap together, so it doesn't look right. Additionally, the snapping functionality just seems totally broken when placing path scenery close to corners. I don't expect to put a bench right at the rounded edge of a path, but I do expect to have a bit more room before it errors out. Another issue I ran into was the object padding, or how close certain objects can be placed next to each other. Now, I don't have any video evidence of this, but I did run into issues where attempting to place flowers or shrubbery close behind a bench just simply didn't work, and it was pretty frustrating. However, I haven't been able to recreate this issue to record it, so that might have been an isolated incident. Overall though, scenery is just a pain in the ass in this beta. It takes a lot of time and effort to get even decent looking scenery, and the process of trial and error with the placement tool is mind-numbing. I'm really hoping they can figure some of these issues out before the next beta weekend, as these could be a real deal breaker. However, one thing I didn't have many issues with was the terrain tool. Basically, you select a terrain brush and pick wherever you want to raise, lower, flatten, or slope the land. The strength of the brush can be scaled back and forth, making precise alterations pretty simple. It works really well and is miles better than altering terrain in RCT2. However, one issue to note is that it simply doesn't play nicely with coaster supports. Once the supports are on the ground, no amount of terrain editing will alter the land beneath them. To avoid this, you really have to consider the terrain you want before you create your coaster, or create both the coaster and terrain side by side, which can be cumbersome. Hopefully this is an issue fixed by launch. The beta included 4 different brush shapes for the terrain tool, and while this might seem like a small number, honestly all I've used so far is a circular brush. I feel like that's been good enough for me for most of what I would use the tool for, so whatever. In addition to these brush shapes, you can also select from a few different textures to paint the terrain with. They included 3 grass textures and 1 sand texture in the beta, and they all looked pretty good. It is a bit concerning knowing that they're offering certain textures as exclusives for the deluxe edition of this game, but that should be a pretty easy gap to fill thanks to Steam Workshop integration. Lastly, the terrain tool also includes raising and lowering water levels. Use the plus button to add water and use the minus button to remove water. The water itself doesn't look amazing, but the physics of it is kinda cool, and the tool is about as dead simple as you can make it. One odd issue I experienced with the tool was that the water levels seemed to naturally lower over time as I built coasters, so I had to go back and refill small ponds every once in a while. This seems like a weird thing to include if it was indeed included intentionally, as it serves as nothing more than an annoyance. Other than that, the water tool is solid. The last thing worth mentioning about the beta was game performance. The PC I played this on is nowhere near cutting edge, however it is a pretty capable machine. According to my frame rate counter while I was playing, I was hitting 60 frames pretty consistently. However, performance does start to take a pretty significant hit when you start adding a bunch of scenery to the park. This is most evident when test riding a coaster, as the game really chugs when you're facing an area with a lot of tree coverage. Vizio has already stated that because this beta isn't an optimized build of the game, the final release will run much smoother, but feel free to take that with a grain of salt. Personally, I still found it totally tolerable and enjoyable to play, but some of you might think otherwise. Additionally, I did encounter some relatively long loading times in the menu, but again, this could be due to optimization issues or whatever, I don't know. One last note on performance. For about the first hour of playing the beta, I must have experienced no less than 4 game crashes where I had to totally reboot my system, which really sucked. However, I haven't experienced one since then, so who knows what the hell happened there. Game betas always have performance issues like this, so none of these overly concern me for the moment. Overall, I was pretty pleased with this first beta. Once I got past the extreme learning curve of the coaster builder, I had found a lot of enjoyment in this game. Of course, it wasn't perfect. I mean, there are a lot of glaring issues with this game at the moment, but collectively those issues didn't keep me from having fun. It's hard to believe that all these issues in the game will be fixed by its release. I mean, it's almost a certainty that they won't be. Another delay would do this game a lot of favors, but Atari seems hell-bent on releasing it by the end of the calendar year. But considering what Vizio has been able to do in their short window of development, I'm still hopeful for this game. And if their promise of free post-release DLC is to be believed, then I'm confident this could be a good, if not great, game down the line. However, all that is remain to be seen. All I can do now is hope that the next beta weekend goes well, as that will ultimately be the deciding factor for me, and probably a lot of you, on whether or not to buy this game. Thanks for watching.